Hello, everyone, and welcome to our December installment of our Facebook Talks. We're glad that you're with us today. And as always, I'm Kathy Essig, your host and the founder and president of Essig Education Group. If you like our talks, please feel free to like us online and share them with anyone who could benefit from them. We would love to get this information into the ears of the families who need it most. On today's talk, we have our guest, Alex Chip, who is the founder and president of Top Score Education. Alex is a nationally recognized expert on the SAT and the ACT and has tutored thousands of students, including mine, on these exams over the years. He's here today to help us demystify the new digital SAT that everybody's very concerned about. So welcome, Alex, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Kathy. Thanks for having me. It is something that's a little bit scary. Every time something is new in this testing world, of course, it's going to be a bit scary. And then you throw some tech in there on top of it. And I'm not surprised that everyone wants to know a little bit more about it.
And that's the piece that people want to know about. What is that tech going to do? So it's going 100% digital, right?
Correct.
And it's starting this spring.
So it started with the PSAT in October. Domestically, and in fact, it's been international since last March of 2023, but domestically here in the United States, it will be debuted in March 2024. And so the PSAT was kind of like a restaurant soft opening. It was a way for them to test out that software and get students sort of used to doing it online. And then the big sort of unveiling will be with the March 2024 SAT.
So what does this mean practically to students? Like what can they expect with being online?
So there's a lot, you have to look at it at a few different levels. One is right at the very superficial, immediate surface level, which of course is that you're going to be taking it on a computer. You're going to be taking it on your computer or your tablet that you're going to bring to the school. You'll be doing it at a school, just like the SAT and ACT have always been done at schools. You're still going to do it there. You're not going to be taking it at home like you took maybe an AP exam during COVID or something like that. It's going to be at the schools. The whole process of the day is going to feel pretty similar. And the difference is going to be, you're going to be doing it on a screen instead of on a paper with a number 2 pencil. And then, of course, the other big change that students are going to feel will be the timing of it. The test is going to be an hour shorter than the current SAT and the current ACT. So students love that. They love that piece. And so it's going to be significantly shorter, a full 33%.
Still the same sections, but just less questions? Or what's the difference that the time difference is there with?
Correct. So it's going to be fewer questions. And the way that the tech works, and in fact, they're not just doing it so that it's on a screen. Part of the adaptive nature of the new test that the tech has allowed, that the software has allowed, means that students are going to have fewer questions, but the test makers believe they can get more information out of fewer questions. I'm not going to get into the total nerdery back end of this. I can at the end if you really want to know, but the more basic sort of philosophy behind this is that with the adaptive test, students will all get the same first verbal section. Based on how they do in that verbal section, they'll get either a second easier verbal section or a second harder verbal section. And so what the test makers, or what this sort of style of adaptive test is meant to do, it's meant to sort of separate students via that second section into better peer groups, in which case they don't need as many questions to sort of decipher how they fit in with their peers across the country.
But in scoring then, how did they differentiate? I got the easy questions and you got the hard questions.
So students will, depending on how many questions they get right in the first section, and that may change from test to test, but let's say that they get 80% of the questions right in the first section, and that's above the cutoff, they'll qualify for the harder second section, and that harder second section will have access to the highest scores. Whereas if you get, let's say, 50% of the questions right, you'll be dumped into the easier second section and you'll be capped out. Even if you're perfect in that second easier section, you won't be able to get a perfect
And
score
go
overall.
above a certain
And
score.
you won't have access to that highest level of scores.
Okay, that makes sense. My other question though, so format and content changes, but I've always said to, the kids I work with EF, if you hit a snag for time purposes, keep going somewhere else in the test. It might help you remember. Can you move backwards and forwards anymore?
You absolutely can. So within a section, you can still move backwards. And in fact, they have little, tools on screen where you can flag a question so that as you move forward through the section, you can see at the bottom of your screen pretty clearly, which questions you flagged. So you can even see at a glance, say, oh, I have 4 questions I want to come back to. Whereas on the paper test, you would sort of have to flip back through your test booklet to get back to the questions you had circled. So in that way, it's actually a little better. And again, I'm a little bit like old school, so I kind of like the paper test better. I'm coming around to the digital test. And as students get more confident and comfortable with using it, I think that they will find a lot of the tools that a digital format allows are really to their advantage. And that goes for both neurotypical and neurodiverse students.
Okay. I got 2 more questions on that one though, because I like the paper too. And I'm thinking of the accommodations, like, so if you have like increased print size, they just blow up the question on the computer for you.
So they'll have, they're going to work hard. Not all of their accommodations questions are completely settled out. There's, at first they said, for instance, that there would be no possibility of having a paper test for students who were sort of sensitive to screen. And then they sort of walked that back and said that they were going to allow it. So there's still some unanswered questions about exactly what accommodations they will provide and not. But yes, some of those things like larger text are fairly easy to do with the software. Some of the things like, multi-day testing becomes very difficult when you've got, and now that's something that's always been a little bit more accessible for ACT students than SAT students anyways, but there are some things that will be harder in that digital test format. So that is going to be one of the things that they have to work through in the first year or two. And I think that we'll be sort of watching them very closely and how well they're able to support students, hopefully as well as or better than in the past.
Because the other thing I'm thinking of is, the child who needs the reader. Okay, so do I get to pick the voice or am I stuck with whatever voice I get if I actually would have had a reader?
So the in the past, it's always been like, as archaic as a CD with the questions read, in a single voice on it. I don't know specifically whether there'll be an option for male voice, female voice, etc. So that remains to be seen as far as I know, but there will be the option for a reader, an accommodation to have that audio played for any question that you're looking at. And that becomes only easier with the digital test than the paper test.
Yeah, as long as you can pick out your voice ahead of time, that you're not sitting there thinking, God, I'm not hearing this properly because I don't like voice, too robotic, too whatever. Kids can get really picky about the talk to text voices.
Absolutely. No, and not just kids. My mom with the GPS, she only will drive if it's the British person reading her directions.
I do that, but it's because I'm like, I wish I were there. Okay, so then I guess on my other question about just the whole accommodation piece would be multi-day testing. If there's a timer on the computer that just, I assume you take it for X amount of time and we don't have to be sitting there with the clocks and stopwatches again because they can time it out on the computer. But what happens to multi-day testing?
So it's interesting. In that way, it's not going to work very differently than the way it is now. So what happens is that when you're sitting there in your proctored, test section, the proctor is still at the front of the classroom. Now the difference is there's not the big, one clock at the top of the wall and the time is written on the blackboard because your software is going to give your time. What it does allow for, and what students may notice as part of their test taking process, and it's especially important for students who may get distracted easily, right? When you're in a class like that, a classroom like that, I think something that a lot of students didn't consider going into, whether it was the digital PSAT or internationally, the digital SAT that has rolled out in the last year, was that inevitably out of a class of 18, 20 students, there's going to be some kind of technical glitch or some kind of user error on the part of a student. And in a way, that's okay. That student is able to access the proctor. And from everything I've gathered, the proctors were pretty well trained to deal with those issues. So if you're a student, don't fear, oh, if my tech breaks down, my life is over. The proctor will have the ability to come over. Your clock generally will stop. They'll be able to restart it. You won't lose the time. So that is nice. However, what it does mean is that for the rest of the students in the room, you may find yourself distracted in almost every test setting. If 1 out of the 18 kids has a problem, they're going to raise their hand, the proctor is going to come over, they're going to be dealing with their situation while your clock continues to roll. So there's a little bit of the pros and cons of that, but each section is self-contained, just like in the old one, and just like the old one, you have your time limit, so that shouldn't really change at all. If you're in a multi-day setting or format, your timed test section will be just what it would be as you were in the national standard test day, just as it was with the paper test. Sorry, that was a long explanation for a simple question.
No, but thank you, because like that, those are the points that, so many of our students are getting those accommodations. And those are the points that I'm sure parents are very concerned about at this point with how does that work? And do I just drop out of the SAT now and move to the ACT because it's still on paper and it's a known commodity?
Well, definitely whenever a test changes, and this happened in 2015 when the SAT went through a big change, as somebody who works with so many students and as somebody who understands that whether you're preparing with me or you're preparing independently, preparation means looking at the patterns of the test, whether that means from looking at past released exams, looking at what the test maker says is going to be on the test. You're looking for patterns, you're studying those patterns and then applying them on the day of your exam. So the fewer patterns that are set, the less you have to prepare with. So anytime there's a new test, through no fault of the test maker or the student, you're going to naturally be less prepared. So one of the things that I'm always telling students with any new test is that if you have the time and the effort and the will to prepare for an exam, generally speaking, all things being equal, you're going to want to take the exam format that has more of a history and set patterns, which in this case would be the ACT. So for all of my students who are scoring fairly similarly in their diagnostic work, of course, I'm going to push them towards the ACT, the known commodity, where those patterns are set and we know what to expect. Whereas for other students who score significantly higher on the SAT, into the digital SAT practice, or for whom other features of the test I think are going to be advantageous, those students will take the digital SAT and shouldn't be afraid to do so. But it's certainly in this sort of first year or two of the new test, there's just one extra layer of decision making that goes into it, and where advice from somebody like me, people in my industry, becomes a little bit more valuable for students who have to make a slightly tougher decision with a little bit less information on the table.
Yeah, a lot less information on the table. So given that, as you said, there isn't a lot to go on with looking at the history of this test, basically a PSAT, should students start planning earlier and maybe prepare for both and just see how it goes and then pick whichever one is better in the moment?
So I like taking a practice test in both. I think it's worth students' time to take a practice test in both. And if they don't have a ton of time, the digital PSAT can sort of stand in for a digital SAT practice test. I think that's okay. And then take a practice ACT exam. Companies like mine, almost to the last offer, totally free practice exam opportunities for students. That's one of the ways that we spread, our word, that we try to do good for the community that does so well for us. And almost all companies do that. So it shouldn't be too hard to find a practice ACT exam to take. And usually with that comes some fairly good analysis and some advice on saying, here's was your PSAT score in the digital SAT or digital PSAT, here's your ACT diagnostic score, here's how they compare, here's a few other factors to look at. Our advice would be to go with this test and here's why. And then you can take that advice or leave it. But it was good sort of free counsel. And that's one of the things that certainly we provide, and most do. So I always think that I always advise students and families to leverage that. It's out there for you.
So I always have students say, and you may disagree with this, please do if you are like, no, Kathy, that the PSAT doesn't really feel like the SAT. So if a student felt uncomfortable with the PSAT, or if they didn't necessarily do well with that, would you say even if they don't really do well on the extra sections of the ACT, that it's worth their while to start early enough to move into the ACT?
I think that certainly, if you've taken your digital PSAT at school, you take your ACT, and then I think it's time for a good reset and sort of evaluate where you are. And then, after taking that ACT, you might say, you know what, that digital PSAT, I wasn't ready for that. Everybody at the school was telling me, hey, this doesn't matter, this doesn't count for anything. And so I treated it as such and didn't have a good day. So I'd like to go do a digital SAT as well to see sort of where I am. And that part of that comes into that test optional conversation, is to say, is the test important for me at all? And I think that sort of looking at sort of what your initial scores are, looking at what improvement might take you to, and then thinking about some of the schools that you're interested in. Now, this is where I think students make a mistake. They only think about their reach schools, but you really have to think about your target schools, the schools where you have very realistic chances of getting in based on your grades and your extracurricular activities. And you look at sort of what is their data, what is the middle, not the average. You want to look at the 25th percentile number of the students that they've admitted in the previous year to look for a score. And you'd say, all right, well, I need to reach that score. Otherwise, the score isn't helping me, because that means that I'm not in the kind of middle group of students who they accept.
Yeah.
You can still apply to the school. That's the beauty of test optional. But if all of your schools, you feel like you're not going to hit that score number, then you might be better off throwing your effort into your extracurriculars, your leadership positions, your volunteer work, some of the things that maybe you're more passionate about anyways. Whereas if you've taken your initial diagnostic testing and you're 150 points short on the SAT of some numbers that could help you, that are in range for some of your target schools, then certainly it makes sense to look deeper into the digital SAT and the ACT and say, in which test is my ceiling higher, and pursue that one.
So, two-part question. Is the ACT right on the heels? Are we going to watch them moving also into digital? Do you have any idea?
So they actually have started, very funny, you mentioned that, in 2 weeks in December, they're now offering optionally the ability to take the ACT digitally. Now, there's a big difference here, because the digital ACT exam is simply, it's basically a PDF version of the paper test. So the test is identical, it's just done on a computer screen. So that's almost, to me, it's more of like an accommodation preference type of thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's the preference of, do you like the computer or do you like paper?
Right. Whereas the digital SAT is a new test, and there are some content changes that I'll go into today as well as to what you're actually executing on the exam. Whereas the ACT, it's just a different medium for students who just simply prefer a screen.
But that would be really good for the child that has trouble with Scantrons.
Yes, that could be. Only issue being that a lot of that would be, to me, for students who have a very specific niche issue with Scantrons that doesn't extend to some of the other issues of showing work, of taking note, because then students who are looking at a test on a screen are statistically much less likely to write things down, to annotate, to draw figures in the math, to show their work in the math, for obvious reasons. And so you might lose what you gain from the Scantron item. And if your issue with the Scantron is so pronounced, probably makes sense to just pursue the accommodation to be able to answer in the booklet and just skip the Scantron altogether.
So second part of that. So door number 3 lately has become test optional.
Mm-hmm.
But test optional isn't necessarily non-tested, right? Some schools are at least developing their own evaluation, right?
So yeah, the test optional is it's a murky area because you have test blind schools like the University of California school system who don't want to see your test scores no matter what. If you have a perfect score, good for you. We don't want to see it. That's in the minority. And then on the other side of the minority, you have schools that are going back to test required. You have Georgetown, MIT, some of the bigger state schools really believe in those scores and their ability to shape the class. And so for those schools, tests are required. And then you got the big group in the middle that's going to be test optional, and they mean it. I think that students are that parents. I think that we're a society that tends to go with the pendulum, and usually the truth is more in the middle. And I think that and you have to be aware of kind of what you read on all the blogs and everything, and you have to use some common sense, which is that if you can achieve good scores and scores that are within the range of students who are accepted to a school, those scores are going to help you get in.
Yeah,
but also if you are incapable of getting those scores, or the effort and resources to get those scores would take away from other pieces of your application, and the rest of that application is very strong, then it's also true that you're going to have a great shot at a lot of those schools. And I think that what the test optional sort of world means is that the end product really to me is that students need to apply to more schools, that there's going to be, whether you have scores or not, there's just going to be a little bit more guesswork in where you're going to get in with your data set. And I tell some of my friends that sort of the days of the college sweatshirt are over, because I can't put my kids in Duke sweatshirts growing up, because if they fall in love with that, they can do everything right and still not get in. That's the nature of the number of applications in the admissions world today. So I think that's one thing to take to heart, is to make sure that you love a lot of schools and don't fall in love too much with any one school. And if you do that, and you take care of the most important things, which are your grades, your extracurriculars that you're passionate about, getting good recommendations from teachers, which means that's not a senior year thing, that's from freshman year on, thinking about building good relationships with your teachers, then the scores can be what they're supposed to be, which is one piece of a holistic and full application, that if the scores that you can achieve are in range of the schools that you want to apply to, then that's something that you pursue and work hard for. And if not, that's also okay.
Yeah, I like that. As I think about this, though, I keep thinking about, I feel for the kids today, always being that first group is hard. So this class and kind of the sophomores and the juniors are the ones that, get to play. How does it work? How doesn't it work? Do you suggest at this point, when you're talking to the kids, just kind of holistically, that they actually look at schools that are test required and schools that are test optional, as they're looking at what range do I fit in, just so they have all their options in play?
I think so, and that's one of the things that your college counselor at your school is for, right. To build out that list. And I think that sometimes I'm bracing for my own 4 and 7-year-old when they get to that point, is that the list is sometimes disappointing, because we have in our head what a school should be and shouldn't be. And I think that we sort of have to clear all that out and just take and know that the college counselors understand these schools, they understand our kids and where they go to high school, and what are naturally good fits for students from this area, from those high schools, with the context that our kids have, and be open to sort of a large range of schools. And then, and look at sort of your numbers in the tests that you have to take as a PSAT, a diagnostic ACT, and then sort of fit and imagine, say, all right, well, if I go up 150 points on the SAT, if I go up 3 or 4 points on the ACT, is that improving my position for some of these schools? And in most cases, it will. And for most students, it will make sense to test. And for some students, it won't. And for those students, it won't make sense to test. And what I tell those students is that, there's no such thing as, a free lunch. Like you don't get to then say, all right, well, I just get to skip that piece when all my friends are having to go to that boring class with Mr. Chip. And and prepare for this exam, you've got to put that time in somewhere else, because your application has one less thing, and that's okay, but you've got to stand out just a little bit more somewhere else.
You have to
And
balance
to
it.
make sure you
So
redistribute
yeah,
that
if you
time.
take one, you have to add another. That's a smart thought. So is there now with, I might be, well, for people who come to you, I'm just going to do the starts of the plugs now. I mean, the way that you set up at Top Score, analyzing which way they should go. And then with my kids, I know I can speak personally. I'm not throwing out, I think this is what they do. I know this is what you do. Being able to say, I know the patterns. You might not be recognizing what you did in the patterns, but it appears if we look at it this way, you're going to go up this number of points. And you were spot on with my children. So as as parents look at that and know if their child is neurodiverse, should we be applying for accommodations much earlier than we used to, just to make sure everything's in place?
I'm always a proponent of applying for accommodations early, just because there's no downside. I think that talking to the counselor at your school in ninth grade, even if they tell you, what, you need to wait a year, you need to wait 2 years. Okay, let's work out the timeline so that I know, and then that's often leads also to other conversations. Is all, are all of our analyses up to date? Do we need to go, back to our doctor to look at how this has progressed or not? And when does that need to be updated, if at all, before applying for accommodations for these exams? And the sophomore PSATs, October sophomore year, that comes real quick, right? And you get to freshman year and all of a sudden that's a year away. So you want to have those accommodations in place so that you can take that sophomore PSAT with your accommodations that you're going to have. Otherwise, it's a wasted day. Taking a test without the accommodations you're eventually going to need was a missed opportunity to see how you're doing, how those accommodations work for you, because you may find that you need to adjust them. That extra time you got, maybe it wasn't enough. And the only way we would have known that was because you went into the PSAT with those accommodations and you found they weren't enough. And that was a good trigger to then take some further steps. So I think freshman year is a great time to go and talk to your counselor about accommodations, to get a timeline for when that will be done. And if it can be done towards the end of spring of freshman year, doing that with the SAT and with the ACT, then you have them, they're good for the rest of high school and you just don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I agree 100%, because I used to speak out of a different side of my mouth when I'd be like, oh, but you want a baseline. Well, but you want a baseline for what you're going to actually be doing. And so that also gives, if you're doing your freshman year, that gives enough time for appeals if there have to be appeals, and more documentation or more testing in order to have more documentation. You just haven't run out of time. There's plenty of time before you get to the SAT if you start your freshman year. So I agree 100%. So when you said that it rolled out internationally already, as you're looking at the data, or even students you work with, because you work with students nationally and internationally, are you seeing that what you would have anticipated on paper is also basically what's happening on a computer?
I think that the most of the big things that the College Board has promised are coming true. And you'll note that in all this conversation, I haven't really yet drilled down into what are the content changes.
Well, that's the last thing I want to go into. Parents really have that as the final point.
The content, and the content isn't very different. And so, that transition, there's going to be one piece that I'm going to get to that also significantly impacts students with accommodations. That is a content change, but for the most part, as far as the math equations you're studying, as far as the grammar rules you're studying, those have all remained fairly similar. What did show up in the rollout? One good thing, which was what I mentioned before, which was that proctors seemed to be pretty well trained by the College Board, that the process went pretty smoothly. When there was a tech error, it was usually they were able to solve it on site, that there weren't big problems, and that the biggest issue in the actual just logistics of taking the test were the slight distractions to some of the students, as a proctor had to help a student who's computer, wasn't charged and needed to find a charger, little things like that. They were distracting, but manageable. And students were sort of just like, I wish I had been mentally prepared for that. And now we are a little bit more, and that's why we do talks like these, so that students are ready for that. And our students, of course, are ready for that. But on the negative side, as I sort of, my greatest fear as a tutor is that always the materials for a new test, are they very indicative of the difficulty level and the question proportions that are going to show up on the real exam? And that was a bit of a miss, in my opinion, in terms of what I'm hearing from students, which was just that the practice tests that are put out by the College Board for this exam didn't demonstrate sort of the higher end difficulty of some of the tests that the students were taking, let's say, in this past October. And that's always the worst case scenario. I'd rather have the practice materials put out by the College Board be too hard, and students are pleasantly surprised because they prepared to a level that was harder and they got to the test like, oh, this felt a little easier. That's great. Rather than go in and say, well, all the College Board never put out questions this hard. Now, some of that can be from students who things felt harder because it was test day and anxiety was high. But I also think that the practice tests put out by the College Board are likely, in hindsight, when this testing really rolls out in more significant numbers, we're going to look back and say, yeah, those weren't indicative of the real difficulty level. Maybe it was 80% of what the students actually face. So tutors like me who sort of have the foresight to think about that, we're always going to push our students and give them material above the level of what the College Board is providing, so that they show up on test day and they don't get any nasty surprises.
So the elephant in the room, what's the content difference and what's the context difference that and do you think just the differences, not necessarily what we just talked about, is College Board putting out something that parents can actually understand what's going to be happening?
I think so. One of the things that the College Board has done a nice job of, and this is since 2015, is the partnership with Khan Academy is a good one. So khanacademy.org is an education software online. It's a website that has a number of subjects, mostly math and science, but they also have a free SAT program, and that's something that they partnered with the College Board to do. And so they have the real questions from the College Board. They have interaction with the test makers, and so they're going to have the most accurate material and content of anybody out there, and it's all free. So, and it's pretty intuitively and linearly laid out for a student to follow a sort of a self-guided path. So for students who don't have the resources to, or the time or the motivation to go into a class or a private tutoring program, that's a really great resource for them. And for parents who just want to understand the test better, it's a very clearly laid out, it's a program that shows you what this test is all about, what the question types are like, and gives you some practice for it. It doesn't do everything, but it's a really nice start, and it was meant to sort of level the playing field a little bit, to give free resources to students who didn't have access to maybe someone like me, and I think they did a really nice job with it, and it's a great resource that all families should look into.
Okay, so where are the content differences though? Like, what are we? Well, before we do that, I got one more question.
Sure.
Are kids? Well, are we ever going to get to a place with the SAT where you can pick paper or computer, or are we just done with paper?
No, we're done with paper.
So
they're very firm about that.
For the child that needs the paper to work it out, they have to work it out, kind of visually and kinesthetically simultaneously. Do they get like as much paper as they want?
So for the for students who they will offer accommodation for a student who really needs the paper version of the test. You'll have to show significant documentation, I think, because they really don't want the reason they really don't want students doing the paper test is it has to be it can't be adaptive. So they actually have to give it's called a linear test, like a paper test. So you're taking, in fact, kind of a different test in a sense. Yeah. And the College Board really doesn't want to do that. So you're going to have to, show some pretty good evidence for why you require that. And then as for sort of students who may not have a strong enough diagnosis for that, but it still causes them problems, they're going to have to learn independently with the parent, with someone like me, to really use their scrap paper very effectively with what's
So you
on the
can have
screen.
as much scrap paper as you need.
You can. There's it is something that I do fear, however, because what you're allowed and what I say proctors are well trained. They've been pretty well trained so far internationally to deal with tech issues. In terms of proctoring exams, they're notoriously not great in terms of some of the little rules and regulations about calculators and such. And so I did hear, there was some inconsistency in that with some students internationally asking for extra paper, and they got a huge stack of printer paper, and other students being denied and say you have the one piece of paper. So that's something that also we always work with our students to make sure that they understand their sort of testing rights, right? And know that they're educated about what they're allowed and not allowed, and confident enough to voice that to a proctor, which is always hard to somebody in a position of power to sort of speak up as a high school student. But we say, this is your test. It's important enough to get into that discomfort zone to advocate for yourself.
Yeah. So
and the content changes. Again, it's actually not that, the bigger changes that students are going to feel. It's really three big ones. Okay. One is the change to the screen, of course, that we already discussed. One is the shorter test that we already discussed. And then the third one, finally, we come to an actual content change that students are really going to feel. And this is that in the reading section, the reading has gone are the long passages followed by 10 questions that have been such a hallmark of the SAT for 50 years. Now it's one paragraph with one question, and then another one paragraph on a new topic and one question. So each of these, it's going to be individual paragraphs with individual questions. Most students will love this because they don't have to keep that focus for 5, 6 paragraphs and 10 questions. They can do one paragraph, one question, and then turn the page. Now, I think this cuts both ways a little bit, because for some students, that's great and they love that. For other students, doing that many different topics, because then you're still doing a number of questions, and now you're reading a lot of different genres in a fairly short period of time. And so that can, in a way, clutter your brain in a different way, that you're having to jump from page to page to a new topic. And so, yes, you're reading less, but you're reading overall a greater number of diverse topics. So it's interesting and how that's going to affect different students differently. And so it's not as simple as to say, like, I think a lot of students are like, oh, shorter passages, I'm going to love this. This is way better for me. I think that's going to be better for some and worse for some.
Yeah, I exactly. I can see that both ways too, because, if I'm a good deep reader, I maybe liked those multiple questions on that one piece. If I'm somebody who has trouble shifting and then also has processing speed issues, I'm still thinking about paragraph A and I'm actually on paragraph D, and that's a problem.
Correct, totally.
Yeah.
And I'll give you two more changes that are a little bit less significant and noticeable to a student taking a test, or or to a parent kind of investigating the test. One is when it comes to the math. So I gave you one verbal, and here's a math one, which is that in the current paper SAT, you've got one section that's with a calculator and one section that's no calculator. The new test is going to be calculator throughout. So you're going to have a calculator for both of your math sections, and you'll have it for all questions on the math. In addition to the fact that there will be no non-calculator questions, the calculator that there's actually a calculator embedded in the software.
I was
called
just going to say, is
Desmos.
it online or do you bring your own? It's online.
So it's online. It's in the software that you use for the test. You do have the option of bringing your own calculator that you're comfortable using from class. But this calculator program called Desmos, more and more schools use it, so students are more and more fluid with it. The way that the test has been constructed, the questions are quite similar to the current paper SAT. However, there are a number of questions that really lend themselves well to being answered using this calculator that comes with the software. So we're certainly going to be advising all of our students to try to learn the use of this calculator and really learn to use it as a tool. And it's going to be one of the things that I think students who don't have someone like me advising them are going to miss. That the learning to use the Desmos calculator can be really more impactful than they would think. They'd say a calculator is a calculator is a calculator, but this particular calculator with this particular test, they marry very well. And I think that's intentional by the College Board. And so that is going to be a change. Whereas on the current paper SAT, this or that TI 84, 83, like it probably doesn't have virtually any impact on your final score output. But now the calculator choice does a little bit, and learning to use it will have a greater impact on your score. And the final content change that I think is worth mentioning, there are other very minor ones, but the one worth mentioning, I think, in terms of practical application, is that just the proportion of questions is changing around a little bit. And so, for instance, on the verbal, as far as the practice materials the College Board has put out, which is all we can really go on in terms of patterns, is that there's going to be a greater emphasis on vocabulary questions and grammar transition questions, meaning questions testing you on the use of the words however, therefore, furthermore, moreover, in fact, those sort of transitions from one sentence to another. And so that what that means for students is that it becomes, to me, just a little bit more of an intuitive subjective test, because sometimes transitions are different. There's a basic nature of transitions of a contrast or maybe a cause and effect transition, but sometimes there are very similar transitions. Let's say however and nevertheless. These are two very similar words and very similar usages, but based on a certain two sentences, one might flow a little better and be a bit more appropriate, but no student is going to analyze that grammatically. They're going to use their listening skills. And with the vocabulary, it's not like the old days where you're going to have a shoebox of 1,000 words and study those things. Studying vocabulary and roots and Latin and Greek roots might help you make some educated guesses, but this vocabulary is meant to reward students who've just read a lot of books and recognize what words sound right in context. What that does for the new digital SAT is it's going to make it a little bit harder for students to quote unquote prepare for the exam. It puts a little bit more on their intuitive skills of listening skills of what sounds right in a transition or what sounds right in a word in context, and a little bit less of an emphasis on learning how a semicolon works, on proper use of quotation marks, on subject-verb agreement, and some of those more black and white sort of rules from the Strunk and White little book that we all got in the 90s. And so that, to me, again, comes the practical execution of that comes in choosing your digital SAT versus an ACT. That's sort of another place where the SAT becomes a little bit harder to prepare for in comparison to the ACT. And so when I have a student who's going to put the time and preparation in, that's a little bit of a shift for the ACT. But on the flip side, if I have a student who I know doesn't have either the time or maybe the motivation to put into really preparing for an exam, that SAT, because it's a little bit more intuitive, we always said the SAT was great, and it still is, for smart slackers, for our students who they're good testers, they get it, but we know they're never going to put the time in to sort of color coordinate each different question type. For those students, that SAT being a bit more intuitive maybe plays to their strength a bit. So again, anything that I might view as a slight negative in a test might be a huge positive for some other students. It's just a difference there.
And there we go with all of us and how we respond to testing. It's what's good for me maybe isn't good for you, and what's good for you isn't good for the kid next to you, and just everybody knowing themselves. But having said that, let's go to, I would like to put up a slide that is your information, and tell me, for students that want to work with someone, with you, should people go through their college counselors, or should they go through, I know people who know? Because I know you're in more places than DC now. You're also in North Carolina and Florida, is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, South Florida and the Durham, Raleigh, Chapel Hill Triangle, and of course Washington D.C. That's where
it all began.
That's right.
But for instance, somebody has a cousin or a friend in New York State that hears about you and really wants to work with you. Do you guys do online as well?
Absolutely, and we've been doing it, since I've been doing it since Skype in 2005, right? So something that we take very seriously is our ability to bring what we do in home to video and remote tutoring. We've for the whole first year of COVID, we had weekly meetings and saying, how are we delivering that sort of personal and intimate experience that we do at the kitchen table? How are we doing that online? And that's been a really huge part of how we've tried to separate ourselves from others, in terms of how much effort and care we put into that. We want to make sure that our students feel like they're getting the best of both worlds when they're remote with us, that they still have face-to-face interaction, but we're also trying to use those interactive digital tools to make the best of what I say. In my ideal world, I like to sit next to the student, right? I like to bang on the table when they're getting tired and say, let's like pep up a little bit and have that presence in the room. That's my favorite. But that's not always the best way for the student to work. Some of them, it fits their schedule better to be remote, and we work really hard to give them that kitchen experience over the internet, and have found that it's been really effective as well.
So I suggest to anybody who is looking and hears this is the gentleman that I used. This is, and we all, our children are our precious commodity. This is the person that I sought out after doing a lot of research. And I must say, my kids came out okay. They did exactly what you thought they would do, which was exactly what I was hoping for. And they are very successful now. So families, there's the phone number. This is the guy. He's got other amazing people working for him. God, you hire really good people, really smart, really caring, really wonderful, wonderful coaches. So thank you, Alex, for joining me. I really, really appreciate this, because I know most of us, I had a million questions, so I can't even imagine what parents who aren't in the field have. So thank you for making this all a lot more understandable. And we appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely, 100% my pleasure. And thank you so much for having me, Kathy.
So everybody, we will see you next month. If you have any questions, please contact Alex's group. They can answer more of your personal questions, I'm sure. And then the more you talk to them, the more your kids are in the best hands if you walk this way. So thank you, and everybody have a great day.